lots of MPs will be asking questions about whether the department is really on top of things right now.
I do want to start with the point that we put to Nick Gibb earlier on, who is the current schools minister, that overall between 2009 and 10 and 2021 and 2022, Department for Education capital spending has gone down by 50% in real terms. Are we now seeing the result of that really quite dramatic cut in capital spending from the Department for Education?
I think it's clear that the DfE for some years under successive Secretaries of State has made the case to make sure that there's sufficient funding going into school buildings. And it seems to me that one of the longer term issues that comes out of this, the most important issue, is children's education and making sure they don't have more disruption to that post-COVID than they've already had. But the other piece of it is the buildings. And as you say, having a proper financing plan for the school's estate that isn't just about the school's capacity we need, but does enable schools to keep up with the maintenance requirements that they've got.
Has the government been too slow to respond this summer? In various papers, there are various timelines for this. Anything from 1995 for warnings on RAC to 5 years ago from the Local Government Association to certainly earlier in the summer. Take your pick. Should the government have responded more quickly?
It feels shocking to lots of people that you could literally get to a few days before the school term and then have some new guidance come out. And I think when Parliament gets back next week, in fact, before then, there are a lot of questions I'm sure that ministers will be asked about the chronology of what information they had and when, and whether any of these decisions could have been taken in a more prompt fashion. I think the reality is that by their nature, if you get news suddenly telling you that there is a safety issue with schools, then you will have to react to it promptly and quickly. But I think it's in a sense the crystallization of a risk that's been there for some years. So I think that will be one of the questions that many MPs want to understand is, how did we get to this stage in the first place? As you say, part of that is what's the question around the longer term maintenance plan for the schools estate. The second question is, what do we do forward looking in terms of fixing that? And the third question, yes, is the process behind all of this, and could we have avoided getting to this emergency action that we've seen in the last 24 hours?
I suppose to some it will seem odd that those questions don't have answers right now. Those are kind of quite obvious questions in many ways. Let's bring Jack in. Jack, this means that pupils are going to be disrupted. They may be taught in porta cabins, for example, or empty offices are being suggested. Basically, it's more disruption, more displacement.
Well, I taught in a porta cabin in my early years as a school teacher, and I can tell you that having a group of highly active teenage boys in a porta cabin beside the tennis court or a hockey pitch where the girls were taking PE was always a bit of a challenge.
Oh, gosh.
It was certainly an interesting start to my teaching career, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. I think there's two big issues here. One is, the irony when George Osborne said over a decade ago that he believed in fixing the roof when the sun shined, and yet to see those massive cuts in school buildings that were initiated by him back in 2010 now having this kind of impact, really does, I think, shame the decision making in the early years of this government. But it also, I think, is a reflection, the current situation is a reflection of the chaos of having so many education secretaries over the last 5 or 6 years, and the general problems of just running an efficient government. I'm a little bit worried about this because it comes hard on the heels of the last minute announcement on school grades, which happened back in August. And that's twice in a row now when the Education Department has made an announcement at the very last minute that's going to have a real impact on the education of school pupils. So there's something not quite right in that department in terms of planning for these eventualities. Once you have a report like this, you have to act on it. But this should have been happening at the beginning of the summer. It should have been sorted out back then. And the schools should have been allowed to be much better prepared for coming back after the summer break.
Justine, it's a good point that Jack raises there, isn't it, around exam grades and now this. As a former education secretary, when you look at how the department is handling these massive moments for pupils and indeed for teachers as well, Would you say that they are dysfunctional, that they are being found wanting in any number of ways here?
I think lots of MPs will be asking questions about whether the department is really on top of things right now. Certainly, the department that I led was one I was really proud of. When the Grenfell fire happened, we were able to literally rebuild a school in a different site, working with other local schools over pretty much a 2-month period over the summer holidays. This is a school that had been badly damaged by the Grenfell fire. So I've seen the department, I think, at its best. I think under recent years, it's been under huge strain during COVID. And it feels to me like there now needs to be a real sense of how it can start to get ahead of the curve on what are some important questions that education faces over the coming years. And let's not forget that we're in the middle of a skills crisis, where at the same time as we have a cost of living challenge for millions of families around the country, there are also, for many employers, great high paid jobs that they are really struggling to find people qualified to go into. So there's the short term challenge, I think, for the department, but also this longer term challenge for Britain and our economy about how this department can really drive the talent strategy that we need as a country if we're going to be successful post-Brexit.
We mentioned questions earlier. Alf in Halifax says, what other public buildings may have been built with this concrete? It's a good question, Alf. We don't know the total number, but we know there are some hospitals, court houses, court buildings as well that will be affected. And I just wanted to mention too that a full report on how many schools in Scotland are affected is expected to be delivered to the Scottish Government in the next few days. There are concerns that thousands of pupils across Scotland might be being taught in buildings with this rack concrete in it as well.
Getting that 3 weeks after the start of the new term.
Yeah.
Why is that not called in June and fixed over the summer? This is just not good planning. This constant exchange of ministers, moving people around, putting hopelessly inexperienced people in charge of departments from time to time. Not at the moment. I think I do have some faith in Gillian Keegan. I hope she's going to knock heads together as a result of these problems this month. But I do think in both Scotland and in England, treating the education service with a bit more respect in terms of who you appoint to ministerial positions and then how long you give them to deliver, and then the budgets you put in place for the long-term programming. This is critically needed. As Justine says, we need the skills of today, never mind the skills of the future, but we certainly need long-term planning to be much better as a country.